Compelling stories are not hard to find. You just need to know where to look. Join your host, Dr. Eric Shaw, prosecutor Ryan Frank, writer Adrian Bonenberger, and comedian Ryan Connor as they interview ordinary people about their extraordinary experiences. This is Baggage.
It's the first time we've all been back together in a while, so this is kind of nice. And Adrian's back with us. Adrian, am I allowed to say where you were?
Yeah, I was in Ukraine.
Just sightseeing?
If there's anyone from the State Department listening, I was there with my wife as she visited friends and family doing remote work for my job.
Well, it's good to have you back safe and sound. Welcome to Baggage. I'm Ryan Frank. We are back again with part 2 with my dad, Don Frank. We're going to go over his time during the Vietnam War. As I mentioned, Adrian's here with us. Adrian Bonenberger, journalist, writer. Ryan Connor, comedian. And Eric Shaw, doctor. Welcome, guys.
Good to be back.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So to recap where we were last time, Dad, you had introduced what you want to talk about as my 3 wars, the counterinsurgency before you left for Vietnam, and even kind of part where you were in there kind of training with the Vietnamese language school. Then where we stopped was actual combat, where you were in combat and you had been assigned Kilo Company. And we had talked about February 7th, 1968, where your company was ambushed. And re-listening to that episode, you had mentioned there were quite a few Marines you lost that day, and you got cut off. Were there other casualties as well? Other Marine casualties as well?
The only Marine casualties were from my company, Kilo Company. We were the only one engaged with the enemy. My company, it was another company, a battalion that came to bail us out, but all the casualties from Kilo Company. And our total casualties were 29 KIAs and 31 WIAs.
And we hadn't talked about it, but it was a NVA battalion that had ambushed you, approximately maybe 800 North Vietnamese. Was there any determination on how many enemy killed that day?
When we pushed through the next morning, there was another Marine unit at a location called Jiolin, which was probably about 3 or 4 miles away, and there was a tank company there. And we requested a platoon of tanks to come down and help us retrieve the bodies. And when we pushed through with those tanks, we counted, and we had a total of 139 that day, confirmed casualties. Then my company went back out there about a week later and reported finding about 60 freshly dug graves. So altogether, we think there were over 200 NVA that were killed during that episode on February 7th.
That seems like you guys, I don't know how to say this, won the day. How would you label that? Because from what I've read about that encounter and the way you've talked about it, it doesn't seem like victory is necessarily how people were describing that encounter.
That's an understatement. I think when you lose roughly 25% of your company in one operation, it didn't seem like much of a victory. And the most, well, I wouldn't say the most difficult, but you were combat ineffective until you had replacements. And then when your replacements did arrive, which was 2 or 3 days later, you know you're going into the field with 25% recruits as it relates to combat. And in a lot of units, a fire team of 4 people, you might have had 1 person who'd seen combat and 3 who hadn't. So it took a while to what I felt confident that we had a efficient, effective fighting company compared to what we had on February 5th and 6th. Maybe numbers-wise, it looked like a victory, but it didn't feel like one at the time.
What did that do for morale in the company? I mean, you were new to the company, but could you see a difference between before that encounter and after that encounter?
That's interesting you say that. I think I had a very fortunate experience. The first time we went to the field after February 7th, which was, I would say, maybe 5 to 8 days later, the battalion commander thought it was important that we get back out and not lay around and lick our wounds for a month or so. So he put us right back to work in about a week. We were leaving the position. The point ran into contact There was a kind of like a clump of trees, maybe 1,000 yards in front of our position. And the point of our company ran into combat or into contact there before the rear of the company had even left the perimeter. So we were engaged in combat the first time we went out after February 7th. And this was just totally opposite. We had come across, we thought it was an NVA platoon that was making its way back to North Vietnam after Tet, because Tet was in January. And we had a lot of action in our area with wounded NVA soldiers returning to North Vietnam. And we ran into this platoon, and there were about 30 of them. And we did have tanks with us at that time. And that was a complete wipeout on our part. We took no casualties, and there were no NVA survivors as a result of that. So that did more to boost the morale, I think, than I did. And it just happened to work out that way. In other words, the first time I went out was the bad one. And the second time I went out was a great one. So, it was a one end of the extreme to the other.
Did it boost your morale too? Did it affect you?
It took more than that. I was still feeling my oats, I think, from February 7th. And I don't know what this is, 55 years later, and I'm still feeling it. So I don't think I was back to normal then.
So that's about a week later. And then where do you go from there as far as what you encounter as significant parts of your combat experience?
Well, I had the company totally about 5.5 months. And we had some good times. One of the more interesting good times we had was, I'll tell you a couple of good ones. One morning, I was shaving, probably 5:30, 6 o'clock, and I happened to see a North Vietnamese woman run from one tent to another. And I said to myself, did I just see what I thought I saw? My radio man was from Chicago, and Willie was his name. And I don't think Willie ever got out of the 6th grade. He mumbled when he talked, very hard to understand on the radio.
This is the radio guy?
This is my radio guy. And the reason I kept him, I inherited him from the previous company commander, that we used to have to bring the platoon radio operators up to live with us for 3 or 4 days so they could understand how Willie talked. And our rationalization was we didn't have to shackle a lot of our conversation, because if Americans couldn't figure out what Willie was saying, we never worried about what the NVA were going to do about it. Many times the battalion commander would get on the phone and he would talk to Willie for a minute, and because he would want to talk to me. And then he would tell me, the battalion commander would say, I've told you 1,000 times, get rid of that guy. I can't understand him. And my response always was, you shouldn't be talking to him anyway, Colonel. You should be talking to me. So all you got to do is ask for the 6, and he'll give you the 6, and you won't have to worry about it. So Willie stayed with me the whole time. And Willie was a great guy. He had a rough life. Some of the stories he told me about his life growing up in Chicago was interesting. So I went to him after I'd seen this, what I thought was a Vietnamese woman going from one hooch to another. And I said, I told him what I'd seen, and I said, I want you to go and find out what's going on down there. So he came back. He was back in about 10 minutes. And I said, what'd you find out? He said, I'll only tell you under one condition. I said, what's that? He said, nobody's going to get in trouble. I said, really, I can't do that. You're bribing me. Something's going on down there. You got to tell me. So we talked and we talked and we talked. And it was one of those, the only way I was going to get out of him what I wanted to was to give in to his demand. So I gave in to his demand. I said, okay, nobody's going to get in trouble. What's going on? And there was a artillery battery in the same position that we were in. And they used to go out every morning with a couple of water buffaloes, which was what we called a thing that carried water. And the 2 units, my company and the other battery, would drink about one of those things a day. And they would go out with 2 of them. And they would fill one with water, and the other one, they would put 4 or 5 Vietnamese women in it. And they were coming back at night and making money with those women. And we had been told in some of our intel briefings that there were known to be Vietnamese women trying to get information from Marines, and we should not have any conversation with them. So we didn't do anything to anybody. I talked to the battery commander about what was going on, and the simplest solution was to go out with only one water buffalo in the future. And all of a sudden, our red light district didn't appear anymore because there weren't any more empty water buffaloes. Really kind of, we were around the area that our B-52 strikes were happening all the while in up north along the DMZ. And we always had to be at least 2 clicks, a couple thousand meters away from a B-52 strike due to the concussion, and to make sure that they landed where the Air Force thought they were going to land and not a click away or so. And I got a call one day from the lead platoon and said that they had just found a bomb crater. It was full of water, and they wanted to know if they could stop and go swimming or take a bath. And I said, no, we're on a combat patrol. Gunny said, what was that all about? And I told him, and he said, Skipper, he said, these guys haven't had a bath in 2 months. He said, can't we set up some type of a perimeter and let everybody at least get some fresh water? So he talked me into it. So we set up a defensive position, and 1 platoon at a time, the company went skinny dipping. And that was the only bath we had in, as I said, in a couple months. The rest of my time, we did have a lot of action. In fact, I was reading and getting ready for this some of the history of 3-3, and I did not realize it. But they said the battalion of 3-3 was engaged in more operations, combat operations in Vietnam than any battalion in Vietnam. And it's only because I think we were on the DMZ a lot. And if you're on the DMZ a lot, there's a lot of bad guys around. So I think we pretty much knew if we wanted to get in a firefight, we would go north instead of south. And you could get in one every day of the week. If you go south, you didn't get as many east and west, you'd find them. But if you went north, we were only probably 4 miles away from the DMZ. So we did have a lot of other engagements, but I don't think I want to go into any more detail about any of them because I just think I've said enough about my combat experiences.
Going back to February 7th, I had read from the No Shining Armor book that Otto Lerac wrote before, and I'm going to go back to something else that Gunny Clark said about the February 7th engagement, is that now that's what I remember about the 7th of February. And he goes through talking about the awards that everyone was given for their heroism that day, that he received a Bronze Star, and Captain Frank, I believe he received a Bronze Star. He should have been awarded a much higher award.
I did not mention that we did have a Marine who got the Navy Cross. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's the second highest, just below Medal of Honor. And he spent the night in the position trying to be killed 4 or 5 times by other NVA. And he was going from one wounded Marine to another to help them throughout the night. And he finally himself was wounded and did not survive as a result of his wounds. But there were enough people in his unit that remembered his heroism, and he was put in for the Navy Cross and was awarded posthumously.
You talked about the B-52 strikes, and I've only seen videos or things like that on the movies. Can you describe what that was like being that close, just a few miles away from one of those?
Absolutely petrifying.
How far did you say you had to be away?
We had to be 2,000 meters away from a B-52 strike. And they occurred very, very regularly. I would say at least 2 or 3 times a week. Even on our engagement in February and in every engagement that we had, I didn't feel sorry for them, but we had total air superiority, and the NVA had no air whatsoever. And I just can't imagine having a unit fighting another unit, knowing that other unit has got so much more combat power than they have. We had one operation where I think the division thought that they had trapped an NVA regiment, and they brought in 4 or 5 other battalions, and we just basically encircled that regiment for about a week or 10 days, and all they did was just bomb that area, and then went through it. So I just can't imagine what it must be like to be in combat when you've got an air problem as well as artillery and small arms. It's just mind-boggling to me. But the B-52s were frightening. And you could hear them, as you said, miles away. And they would always happen in the middle of the night, and the ground would rumble. Even where we were, the ground would rumble.
You had said that you were supposed to not call in a B-52 strike more than a couple clicks away from you. Do I remember correctly that you broke that rule one time? Did you tell me a story about that?
Well, I think you said I call in a B-52. We couldn't call them in. They were all ordered by probably somebody back in the Pentagon that decided where they were going to strike. So we could request supporting close air support. And, in the February 7th, we had, close air support that you could look at the faces of the pilots coming in. So you could call in close air really, really close. And when you're in deep crap, you can get it really close.
And what does that look like? Is that like helicopters or is that jets? Or
jets, mostly jets. And sometimes, or not sometimes, a lot of times it would be helicopter gunships were pretty effective also. The problem with the gunships is they drew a lot of fire from the bad guys, where jets could come and go, and a lot fewer chances of getting shot down with small arms, where the helicopter, that was one of the big problems with that we had on February 7th was bringing in the medevacs, because it was a hot zone the entire time.
I'm wondering, you mentioned a little bit about the replacements, and something that I've only really started thinking about more deeply since helping train folks in Ukraine. I didn't think about all that much when I was in the military, when the Army was training. So in Vietnam, as I understand it, the way it would work would be a unit would be assigned to Vietnam, and then it would get slowly backfilled by basically people going through basic training, and then they would get sent right to Vietnam. Or would they go to the unit? Like, did they have unit training, or were these soldiers who were just pretty much, how to use a rifle and do first aid, but you'd never been on like a company patrol or a platoon patrol until you got to country?
When I was there, that's the way it was. The replacements were all individual. In fact, we had a speaker at one of our reunions who happened to be a company commander in Vietnam. And one of the things he said that I didn't realize, that when the Marine Corps started to go into Vietnam in 65, 66, they were going in as units. The Marine Corps realized after a year or two that we were going to stay there for a long time. So what the Marine Corps had to do was to start to transfer people from the unit that they were with over to this unit, and then bring in a new person to replace him. So you wouldn't be replacing an entire unit at one time. So from about late 67 through the end of the war, all the replacements were, if you were a private in the Marine Corps, you went to boot camp, and from boot camp, you went to Vietnam. And if you were in the infantry, your combat training was your first combat patrol. And if you happened to run into contact, then it was for real. And so the only training you got was the infantry training you received in boot camp. And the rest of it, unfortunately, was OJT.
It's a really different way of doing things. And again, looking at the Ukrainians, and I helped train last year a battalion size reconnaissance element. So like a company plus of recon people, more than that, about 300 people. And they had so basic training. They didn't have a ton of basic training. The more competent guys were like, good, and the less competent guys were less so. Mm-hmm. But they had no like unit training for offensive operations. And so when this counteroffensive was kicking off in like the spring and summer of last year, I was thinking to myself, like, man, these guys, they can't move as a company. Nobody in this unit knows how to move as a company. Like even the company commander doesn't have experience maneuvering soldiers as a company. The battalion commander doesn't have experience maneuvering companies, and the brigade commander doesn't have experience maneuvering battalions. I think when you're in when you're on the defense, you can probably fake that a little bit. If it's a trench or something, it's just like, okay, here's a rifle pointed in this direction and shoot in this direction. But moving, like you're talking about the ambush, it's so hard to explain to a person who hasn't been through it, like what it's like to maneuver units. Like a platoon is doing this, a platoon's doing that, a squad's doing this, a squad's doing that, how it all fits together. And it just like, we did a lot of training. We'd have like a year or more of training going into Afghanistan. And I think it was the same thing with Iraq. You just have, and that's probably, thinking about it, it's probably because of experiences like, of you and folks like you in Vietnam who are like, look, if 25% of my company doesn't know how to move in a squad or a platoon, and they've got to have somebody explaining it to them in combat, That's crazy. Of course, you're going to take more casualties.
I don't agree with 100%. I think here is where I saw it. You were replaced as individuals. So as an individual, the first time you went to the field, it was you were an individual, but the unit, I think, was operating as a unit. And a lot of people in that unit had been to the field many times. So that's why I was concerned, as I said earlier, that when 25% of my company was new, that was 25%, as I said. You might have a fire team with only one person who was familiar with what was going on and 3 were brand new. That's a situation I think you just referred to, but that's a rarity. Normally, I would say 95% of a unit had experience of doing what they were doing. It's the individuals. And that's even from the generals right on down. I mean, a division commander in Vietnam, he'd never commanded a division in combat. He'd never commanded a division before because he just made major general a year ago and he never had a division. In my case, I mean, the first time I go to the field, it's brand new for me. Now, all my lieutenants and my gunny and first, all those people, they were experienced, but I don't think the unit was ill-prepared for what they had to face on a daily basis. It was the individual, that first month as an individual, regardless of what rank you were, was as I said in part one, when this staff sergeant and I were watching everybody get off a helicopter that were coming to my company after we had lost so many. And I mentioned to him that where were these guys 6 months ago? And they were in high school. And I said to him, I can't imagine what's going through their mind. And he said something that I'll never forget. He said they'll either learn fast or die young. From an individual point of view, that's true. But the unit, I don't think, was in that case. It was the individuals that had the problem, or the challenges, I should say.
Did you find, at least with your company, that it was predominantly conscripts, or was it mostly volunteers, or was it kind of a mix of everybody?
The Marine Corps initially had prided itself on never having to take any drafts. But during Vietnam, we did have to take the draft. I can say you could not tell the difference. I couldn't tell the difference between a drafted Marine or one who volunteered. One of the biggest problems that all the services had was many of the individuals that were drafted for Vietnam did very well, but a lot of them didn't have an education, and they would stay in the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps as I wanted a career, and a lot of them just didn't have the academic and educational background to survive. And that was, I think, that was our biggest problem, was after Vietnam, with the number of draftees that had some real challenges as they moved up the ranks from both leadership and academic or ability to advance in the organization.
I have another question that I'm very interested in, and I don't know if this is something that you and Ryan have talked about before, but I'm always very curious what the Vietnam veterans think about and how they talk about it amongst themselves when they're talking about the Iraq and Afghan veterans. Like, when you're looking at what we went through, knowing that where you were and what you were doing and the technology and everything were different. It's not an apples to apples comparison, but you're not going to get a much better comparison than like counterinsurgency Vietnam, counterinsurgency Iraq, Afghanistan. Like, there is a comparison to be made there. So what do you think when you look at, what we went through and what we did? What is that? What do you guys think about and talk about? Broad question.
First of all, Ryan and I don't discuss it very much at all. In fact, I probably learned more from Ryan about what he did in Iraq from listening to him talk to other people than he and I talk. We just have not spent a lot of time discussing it. But to answer your question, I think the Army, in my opinion, fought much more of a counterinsurgency than the Marine Corps did because of the nature. South Vietnam was in a civil war, and the Viet Cong were the South Vietnamese who wanted to side with the communists or with the North. So they were not nearly as well trained or well resourced as the NVA were, which was an outfitted military organization by the communists, and they had fought the French and all that sort of stuff. And so I think we fought a much more of a conventional war in the North. And I think that was probably a big problem for the commanders in Vietnam. They were fighting two wars at the same time. And when I returned from Vietnam, I went to a school for captains at Quantico it was called Amphibious Warfare School. And in all formal schools, they have an opportunity to listen to briefings from the heads of all the services. And we happened to have an opportunity to listen to General Westmoreland. He had come back from Vietnam, and he was now Chief of Staff of the Army instead of the Supreme Allied Commander in Vietnam. And he basically said that the strategy when he was there was to prepare the country for a full-scale conventional war, building roads and doing this and doing that. And I think in retrospect, that was a bad strategy. We lost the support of the American people. By the time we get the roads and everything built, we lost the support of the people that you had to have to support the war. In all practicality, we lost that war. I think there were two different wars. I think I would have rather fought my war than the war you guys fought, because not knowing, there was a lot more unknowns, I think, from what I understand of both Iraq and Afghanistan. We had some problems with roads being mined, but not nearly the problems I think that the Afghan and Iraq faced. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but yeah, and both the NVA and the Viet Cong and the Afghans and the Iraqis, they all proved that you don't need the big stuff to win.
I definitely don't want to dominate the conversation here, but considering the topic of the podcast and sort of the nature of, memory and everything else, and how we deal with the past and how we deal with our experiences, I do think it's, what you said right there is something that a lot of people, Vietnam veterans, Afghan veterans, veterans of Iraq, think about similarly, which is that idea of, I guess we lost it. I guess in the end we lost but I disagree. I don't think so. Like I had a pretty similar, I didn't have a completely similar experience to you in the sense that, there wasn't like a regular conventional version of the Taliban, but I was out on the border on both of my deployments. So we were doing it was a lot more fighting and a lot less kind of like walking through villages looking for people who might be Taliban or Al-Qaeda or something like that. It was pretty conventional. It was pretty standard mountain warfare stuff. But we, even when we didn't win our little, our fights, we had to come back. We had to withdraw, fight a retrograde, not retreat. We went back the next day or the day after. And eventually my feeling was tactically we did win. I feel like it's like on the State Department or the politicians to win the war, like a war. It's kind of, that wasn't on us, that you were a company commander. Like you shouldn't feel like you lost or that we lost in Vietnam, because you didn't. Like I didn't lose in Afghanistan. It definitely wasn't my responsibility. I don't know. When I hear that, I think like, no, we didn't. I don't know of anybody who lost except whatever generals were telling, the president that, it's going to be one more year and we're going to turn a corner. Those guys probably lost, but we didn't.
In my mind, we lost Vietnam. I don't give a shit what anybody else says. That was not a victory, Now, I think we didn't lose as a result of our efforts to try to win. That I would, go to my grave saying we did a hell of a job. But when you go to war, there's a lot more than just fighting and all that sort of stuff. So I think as a nation, let me put it this way, we lost.
I kind of want to echo what Adrian and you, I think you were saying too, Dad, of like when you're in the Marine Corps or you're in the military, in the moment, you're not thinking about international politics. You're thinking about the mission. And if I ever had to pull the trigger, and thankfully I never had to shoot anybody, but if I did, I was going to be doing it for my fellow Marine. You do the mission. And I think that what I can say is I think myself and the unit I was with did that very well. I'm sure it sounds like 3-3. Just the history says they did it very well. And likewise, Adrian, as it's been reported with you and your unit, do the task and leave the rest up to the politicians.
Were there ever moments for both of you where you, like at least during your deployment, where you start to question your local allies, sort of what they are willing to do for this fight for freedom? Like, because at some point, you like we saw with Afghanistan, at some point, people decided, well, we will take oppression over constant struggle or a constant violent struggle. Was there ever a point when anything felt like that? Like, well, if we loosen up what we're doing, are they going to be able to hold up the fight? Or it's because the communists were their ideology was so inset, did it feel like if we aren't always there, that wave is going to come at some point, just because they believe in their cause more?
No, in fact, I was convinced that we were going to win the war when I was there. Mm-hmm. In fact, when I returned, I was still single, and I can remember we were at my sister's house for Thanksgiving dinner, and I was after dinner, and somebody said, "What are you going to do after school?" And I said, "I'm going back to Vietnam." My sister just about killed me. She said, "Your mother almost died and had a heart attack." But the longer that I was back in the States, the less I was anxious to return. And then before I left my duty station after school, which was Syracuse, also recruiting duty, the war had really taken a turn, and the Marine Corps was on its way out by that time. But no, when I was there, I never worked directly with any South Vietnamese forces other than the students at schools and stuff like that. But no, I thought the Vietnamese people that I dealt with really thought freedom was worth fighting for.
Because we have another friend who had been telling us for like 15 years that he was like, the general Afghani does not want to fight. When it comes to it, they will take their old way of life over fighting for freedom.
Yeah, that was, we saw the effects of the pullout, which was like we weren't even done like booking plane tickets, and that place was collapsing like a cardboard box in a heavy rainstorm. And not because they're bad people. In fact, I look back on the Afghans as a pretty devout people in general. When Don was telling that story about the North Vietnamese women, I was thinking about the first thing I thought when he was talking about that was like, man, I saw the bare ankle of one Afghan woman because like a wind like whipped up and like lifted her hijab, like covered head to toe. And I remember thinking that was the day of the election, I guess, in 2011 or 2010. I was thinking like, that is the first time I've seen like any uncovered part of a woman like in the wild in months. So there wasn't, because again, they were they were a terrifically devout people. I don't know if that's a cultural thing, but this is a pretty, safe area, government controlled area. And I think that was probably a point of difference between Afghanistan, maybe Iraq as well. Again, I was never in Iraq. I don't know. But that idea of their culture and yeah. So as a result of that, probably for them, there were people in Kabul who were like, wanted democracy or wanted whatever we were selling, wanted a representative form of government. And in the tribal areas where I was out by the border in the mountains, people were like, whatever, I pay 10%. I got to pay 10% of my crop to the government, or I got to pay 10% of my crop to the Taliban. And the Taliban like don't raid my house at night. Maybe they do now. I don't know. Who knows what the Taliban are up to now? And I'm certainly not saying the Taliban are better, but to your point, yeah, I think there was always a lot of the government just never really did a good job of making their case to the Afghan people why it was in their interest to be with the government rather than the Taliban. And so now they're back with the Taliban.
Yeah, a friend who does some intelligence stuff there said that the biggest thing in the day-to-day, because if you're out in the country, you're not really interfacing with them regularly, you know? And then he said one of the things that made people just sort of go along with it was with the government officials, just say you're driving down the road, you'd have to pay a bribe every time you pass someone. With the Taliban, you only had to do one a day. They'd give you a ticket that said you've paid your bribe for the day. So it was this exponential level of bribe you had to do. And for them, you know, that's enough for them to go, all right, I guess back to the old ways.
Yeah, and corruption too. I think corruption drove a lot of people crazy, where it would be like with the government, it was you had to know. It was sort of like the government that people knew was in the countryside was like very quasi aristocratic. So it was like the rich guy's son like killed somebody, like, but he doesn't have to pay Badal because he's the rich guy's son. But the Taliban were seen as enforcing. But I think, I don't know, I've read a lot about Vietnam, and it sounded like it was kind of similar there, where it was like the South Vietnamese government was seen as really, really corrupt and not a great partner. And then the North Vietnamese or the communists, whatever, the nationalists, they believed in something. I think, I don't know, it seems to me, looking back on Afghanistan, and maybe for you, Don, looking back on Vietnam, like when you don't have a lot, if you're in a pretty poor area, if you're pretty impoverished, like believing in anything is better than believing in nothing. Like whatever the corrupt government is, if somebody comes in and says, we're doing communism, so everybody's got to pay 80% taxes, but everybody pays 80% taxes, people are like a lot less upset than if some people have to pay 90% taxes and then other people don't have to pay taxes at all. So it's almost like on a national level, like, yeah, people just really don't like it when things are unfair and corrupt. They hate that, actually.
You were talking about your 3 wars, Dad, and what was the third chapter to that?
My third war was, as I said, when I returned, I went to school at Quantico for 9 months. And then I went to Syracuse, and my title was an officer selection officer. And my office was in Syracuse, and I had all the colleges and universities north of Poughkeepsie and east of Buffalo. So basically, I had to stay in New York, colleges and universities. When I would go on campus with a set of dress blues, which we always did, I was not welcomed by hardly anybody. In fact, I'll give you a quick overview of my 2 years at Syracuse as an OSO. I reported in probably mid-August, and I relieved another captain who had been there for 3 years. He was a Yale graduate. He was a artillery officer. He had received a Silver Star in Vietnam. I walked in, and he looked at me. He put his hands in his pocket, threw me the keys to the office, and as the keys were floating through the air, he said, "Take these keys and jam it up your you-know-what, and I'm out of here." And that was our turnover, which was a shock. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. He was the only officer at the time in the office. The next senior was a Navy chief. We had a corpsman chief because we used to do our own physicals. I had a gunnery sergeant. So the gunny came into the office, and I said, "What the hell just happened?" And he said, "Captain so-and-so is not a very happy guy." He said he's been here for 3 years. He came here as a career officer, and for the last 3 years, he assigned 6 fitness reports as unsatisfactory. His mission was to recruit for the Marine Corps, and he failed his mission for the last 3 years. So he happened to be working for a boss who really had no idea what was going on in the real world. And that is the environment that I inherited. And I was a captain with about 3 years in the Marine Corps now at this time. And I saw my career going up in smoke. I said, holy crap. And I volunteered for this. You know, I turned down some jobs because I wanted to do this. So we got ready for our first visit. Our first visit was Cornell. We go to Cornell. When I was recruited back in 1960, probably is when I joined the Marine Corps. The Marine recruiters, there were 2 captains, I think, that visited the campus. We were in a student union, and the place was full of people, and they set the table up, and everybody was coming and talking to them, and on and on and on. When I went to Cornell, I was put in the ROTC facility, which was on the fringe of the campus, in the basement. And I was told by the people who'd been there a couple of years, or my team, that you always set up with a wall behind you, so the student protesters cannot sneak up from behind you and do things like that or do whatever they're going to do. So we were in there. We usually, our hours were from 10 o'clock in the morning until about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we'd been there for about an hour or two. Nobody had come and talked to us. And all of a sudden we looked up and we saw 3 or 4 girls coming at us, and they were carrying gallons of paint, open cans of paint. And we all looked at each other and we said, this is going to be interesting. What's going to happen? They came up and never said a word and just threw the gallons of paint at the 3 or 4 of us. I happened to be the closest to them, and it literally splashed off my head on my face, and it was a real mess. The only good thing about it was a water-based paint. If they'd have been smart enough and bought oil-based paint, it would have been a really mess. But I went to the shower and took a quick shower. But when paint dries on a uniform, it dries, and it never comes out. And that was my first visit.
Dad, where's the dress blues now? Where is it now?
The dress blues are up in my closet.
I thought the Marine Corps Museum had them.
Well, they want them, but I'm not going to give them to them until I die. Then they can have them because I like them. You know, I look at them every once in a while. They wanted them, and everybody says I'm supposed to give them to them, but I haven't given them to them yet. And well, I go to OCS right now on Sunday nights, and every once in a while when I get melancholy, I take my blues and I put them up on a stage, and I give them, this is what it was like to be a Marine on a college campus in 69, I think is when I was there.
You don't want to give up your prop.
No, that's my prop. It's a hell of a good prop, too. Very colorful. So that was my first visit. And now every quarter, we have quotas. We have so many, what we call freshmen and seniors and juniors and OCS classes we're supposed to fill. And I wasn't making quota. And I saw my career going in the same direction as the captain I had replaced. So I was getting concerned about, we got to do something. I had, fortunately, for my part, they had beefed up my office. I had 2 lieutenants. They had given me another staff sergeant. So I had a team of about 7 or 8 people. And we were brainstorming one day of what could we do. And one of the lieutenants said, Captain, I suggest that myself and Staff Sergeant so-and-so become a civilian. We take our uniforms off and let our hair grow long. And we'll go on campus a week or 2 before you guys get here. We'll stuff mailboxes. We'll do this and we'll do that and see if we can't get somebody to at least, we couldn't get anybody to join the Marine Corps because nobody would talk to us. So I said, okay. So we did it. And it started to work. We started to make quota. But we couldn't tell anybody what we were doing. We would go to conferences and everybody would say, Syracuse, what are you doing in Syracuse? We're doing this, we're doing this. And we were big heroes until one day I was in Rochester, RIT, which is a really great school. And we had to send to my boss every month an itinerary of what campuses we were going to be visiting and how many people were going to be there. So he had picked to come to Syracuse that day and to see how we were doing and how come we were making quota and nobody else was. So I had a gunnery sergeant with me, and the lieutenant and another staff sergeant were on campus. So we're supposed to be 4 people. So we were shooting a breeze, and he said, you guys are doing so well, I want to take you all out for dinner tonight. And then I said, oh, shit, here it comes. So these guys were in civilian clothes, long hair, no uniforms. So I had to tell him what he was going to see that night for dinner. We didn't have to wait for dinner. He said, get a hold of him right now. Cancel your visit. You're going back to Syracuse, and they're going to put the uniforms back on. If you have to take your uniforms off to sell the Marine Corps, that's not the kind of Marine Corps I'm aware of. So that's what we did. We went back to Syracuse, took off the uniforms, and got their haircuts, and we never made quota again. We went back to the same old way because the Marine Corps later in the war was really getting some really bad publicity. There was a hooch that had caught on fire was a Zippo lighter, and some babies, small children in the house had burned up. So we were called baby burners, baby killers. And one of the things that really helped me survive my recruiting tour was I lived with a kid that I went to high school with. He became a history teacher, and he was teaching in Syracuse, and we were both single. So we got an apartment together. And he had become a very strong anti-Vietnam individual. He was quite liberal to start with, and he was on one side of the war, and I was on the other side of the war. And we used to have some knockdown, slam-outs, almost fisticuff discussions at home. But it prepared me for what I had to talk about every week when I went on campus. So I subscribed to all the underground literature. In fact, there was one time after I'd been there for about a year and a half, we had a civilian secretary, and she came in to the office one day and she said, Captain Frank, she said, there is an FBI agent here. He wants to talk to you. So he came in and he said, you're Captain Frank? And I said, yes. And he said, well, according to the Marine Corps says that you are subscribing to these periodicals. And it was the RAG and this and that and all that sort of. I said, yes. And I told him why. I said, this is what the students are reading. So I figure if I want to know what they're talking about, I'm going to read what they're reading. He said, off the record, you need to cancel those subscriptions right now because it's not reflecting good on your library of information. So I canceled them all and put them in my roommate's name. And they still came to the house and I still kept reading them. We never did make quota again, but it was probably one of the more interesting assignments that I had in the Marine Corps. And the reason that I refer to it as my third war was it was a war against the sentiment of the country that had lost support in the war. And we're taking it out on basically us and anybody who represented what they were against. But one of the things that when I was working after I retired from the Marine Corps, I taught at a community college. And sometimes students would get me upset because they would be so lazy they wouldn't do anything. And I would tell them, I said, at least, during Vietnam, the students they got interested in something, they did something. I said, you lazy bums, you don't do anything, and at least the students back in the late 60s, they really, they turned the tide, and they believed in something. So that was my third war.
Dad, can you tell us a little bit about the idea of PTSD from Vietnam?
Yeah, I have a really simple solution, I think, to PTSD, and that is people don't talk about their experiences. And I would like to say that I don't think I had a lot of PTSD issues. Sure, every once in a while you think about this and you think about that, but it doesn't consume my life. So many of the Marines that were with me in Vietnam that I saw for 30 or 40 years after Vietnam, the war ruined their lives. I mean, they really came back with serious PTSD issues that most of them never addressed until it was too late. They had lost their marriage. They had done this. They had done that. They were down and out, and then they realized they had to do something. A lot of people, both officer and enlisted, who stayed in the Marine Corps, the natural thing is to, what'd you do in Vietnam? And you talked about it. It became a part of your life. And that's why and anybody and I don't think it has to be a combat situation for PTSD. It's anything that's traumatic in life. If you talk about it, it helps. That's my 2 cents on PTSD. Well, and I'm really frustrated at DOD that, I think we had a good handle on it after Vietnam. It was a big deal for 10 years, and then we kind of forgot about it, and we lost all the initiatives that we might have had started back then. And then Iraq and Afghanistan starts all over again, and now all of a sudden it's a huge deal, and it's much bigger now than it was in Vietnam because of the medical care is so much better, and there are so many more people that are surviving terrible situations. I think we really dropped the ball on that part of veterans' health.
You said talking about it maybe is why you don't think you have many or any PTSD issues. Talking about it with who? Because I think that a lot of what you've shared with us is the first time the public has heard anything about that. First I've heard of some of these stories. So who were you talking to?
When I say it's the first time I've talked about it, when I was on active duty, many times you would talk to other captains, what was the worst thing you ran into? And I said, this was mine. So I wouldn't say that I hadn't talked about February 7th before. I had just never talked to people other than Marines about it. I just don't think that something that I feel really confident talking about that with people who haven't experienced it myself. you don't want to glorify people getting killed. I think it's pretty bad.
Adrian, you and I have kind of talked about the PTSD thing being a factor if what you're doing doesn't kind of sit right with your paradigm. And we're like, if you're a warrior and you're fighting, that's a good thing. Whereas if you're a doctor and people dying, that's a very bad thing. And I can just imagine where, Don, you had talked about when you got that first command that you wanted to get in there, you wanted to fight. And so that kind of what you guys were doing may have kind of agreed a little bit more with your paradigm and what your job description was versus some of these draftees who you said were just weeks before in high school. It's got to be a lot harder for them to kind of square what they were doing if that wasn't something that they necessarily signed up for.
Yeah, I have a tendency logically to agree with you, but it wasn't my experience or it wasn't my experience that I could tell the difference between a draftee and a volunteer. And I think it's really because if I feel that way as an individual, I certainly am not going to let my command know that's how I feel. And so that I think might have been the cause of PTSD. They had not only had they seen things that were difficult to handle, they were suppressing how they really felt the entire time they were there. So the combination of those two, I think, must have been would push anybody over the edge when you got back. And that would be compounded by the people that you're now associating with, which is the anti-war people. And it wasn't only the students, it was millions of people against the war, that you felt even more isolated because and you didn't want to talk about it. You didn't want people to know that you had participated in it. Guilt feelings and all that sort of stuff, which I really never thought, to be honest with you, Eric, as a potential subset of strong PTSD issues. In fact, it'd be interesting to see the percentage of volunteers versus draftees and PTSD issues.
Right, because the idea being if you're a draftee, you're in, you're out, you don't have that social circle that you did for another, what was that, almost 15 plus years after?
Yes. Yeah. I had about 6 years in the Marine Corps, so it was probably almost 14 years afterwards to, talk it out internally.
I hope and the other Vietnam vets know that, like, among the Afghan and Iraqi vets, the veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq, we talk all the time about how much, how well we had it. We had it really good in a lot of ways. And it was pretty clear to us. It's always been very clear that that's because the Vietnam veterans really bent over backwards to, work with the VA, work with the government to make things better for us, better quarters, better chow, all that stuff. So from our perspective, you guys, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here when I say, Vietnam veterans, there's a huge reverence for your community among us. We just feel a lot of gratitude to you. And anybody going into Afghanistan or Iraq doing counterinsurgency work read the Marine Corps manual on counterinsurgency that got written during Vietnam. Whether or not that was, your unit, was definitely, part of the Marines. So we just can't thank you enough for all the work that you've done over the years.
One of the things that I don't like is people who don't know what to say to a veteran. And it's not a Vietnam veteran, it's all veterans. And that's thanks for your service. That just makes me puke every time I hear it. I want to come up with another term that's original instead of thank you for your service. I go to Lowe's and I pull out my Lowe's card because I get 10% off because I'm retired something. Thank you for your service, sir. It's so meaningless,
I saw a good meme on Veterans Day where it was saying thank you for your service, and it was a army guy with the iPad and the tip options, like facing forward.
Right. Yeah, that's better.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's going to do it for this episode. If anybody has any questions, thank you for the listener email. Keep them coming. thebaggagepodcast@gmail.com. I don't have anything to plug because I'll never have anything to plug other than this podcast. So tune in a couple of weeks. We'll have another carry-on episode. You guys got anything you need to say?
Yeah, I do. My latest special, live from DC, is now on Amazon Prime. You used to have to pay for it, but now it's just regular Amazon Prime. And my book, The Party, is also available on Amazon.
Sweet. And it's good. We've all read it. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
For once, I have actually kind of something to plug for my business. We are in the process of piloting a integrated healthcare model. We have a new provider, Jess. She is going to be working with us to provide more and more in-depth mental health care in the office with warm handoffs from providers so that we can get you care that not just that day, but that minute, get someone seeing you, working with everybody. We hope to expand that in the next year or two to probably have 2, if not 3 more providers.
Well, Dad, thank you for your service. and thank you for doing this. I know this wasn't an easy thing to do, and I don't know where this podcast is going in the future, but if nothing else, this was definitely worth it. So thank you very much for coming on here and doing this.
Thanks for asking me, and I did enjoy it. And you guys they're kind of fun. Now I can go back to my old creaky chair, right?
Music for Baggage provided by Quincy Ledbetter. You can find his stuff at qledbetter.com. Graphics provided by Megan Weaver. You can find her at meganweaverart.com. Special thanks to our premium members for their support. You can become a premium member by clicking subscribe in your Apple Podcast app or by visiting thebaggagepodcast.com/support to sign up or to gift a membership to someone. A percentage of all proceeds go to charity. If you have any questions, comments, or a good story to share, please email us at thebaggagepodcast@gmail.com.